tears, by the way.
Okay, welcome to E for Exciting Unitarians, part 1 of 2. And we have a quote from
the next one.
We have a quote from this well-known guy, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Write it on your heart that every day is the best day in the year. He is rich who owns the day, and no one owns the day who allows it to be invaded with fret and anxiety. Finish every day and be done with it. You have done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities no doubt crept in. Forget them as soon as you can. Tomorrow is a new day. Begin it well and serenely, with too high a spirit to be cumbered with your old nonsense. This new day is too dear, with its hopes and invitations, to waste a moment on the yesterdays. So welcome to another of my occasional talks on famous Unitarians. And as always, don't worry if this is your first one. Each stands on its own. As always, we've broken our guests into 6 categories, and we go from oldest to youngest by birthday within category to get a sense of who lived when. Today, I think we're going to get through agents of change, arts and literature, and education. Agents of change is my favorite category, the one from which I draw the most inspiration. But not many Unitarians start with E, except Emerson's and Elliott's, so we have only 2 agents of change today. Let's take a deeper than usual look at what they did and how they did it. Our first agent has no picture, nor a book of her own, but there's still plenty to tell. Like many Unitarians, Sarah Otis Ernst was born in Boston and traced her ancestry back to the Mayflower. Her parents were friends with the fiery Unitarian abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Here's some radical Garrison quotes. The compact which exists between the North and the South is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. With reasonable men I will reason, with humane men I will plead, but to tyrants I will give no quarter. Unquote. Today we are all of us radically anti-slavery, as we should be, but back then many Americans thought slavery no worse than the harsh capitalist factories of the North. Garrison was once dragged through the streets of Boston at the end of a rope by an angry mob of several thousand who tried to lynch him. When Sarah moved to Cincinnati and married well, she became a Western outpost for Garrison's views. She organized the Cincinnati Anti-Slavery Sewing Circle. They sewed clothing for runaway slaves. They also raised funds for the annual Western Anti-Slavery Society Convention, held 200 miles north in Salem, Ohio. But by 1851, Sarah's sewing circle found the Salem group too conciliatory. They organized a Cincinnati anti-slavery convention. They had famous radical speakers, including Garrison himself in 1853. They drew large crowds and got major newspaper coverage. But Sarah had trouble finding enough volunteers to run the event, and 1855 was its last year. The Ernsts gave generously to Unitarian and Universalist causes. They made a gift of 300 apple trees to Aidan Ballew's Hopedale community, one of the utopian farm communes that sprung up and died out again in the 1840s. After her husband died in 1860, Sarah moved her family back to Boston and lived in Jamaica Plain, where she joined St. John's Episcopal Church. Decades later, 2 of her sons commemorated her abolition work with this unusual stained glass window, a black Madonna with a white Christ child. Katherine Phillips Edson. I've got a whole little story for Katherine. She was a suffragist. She succeeded at that and then got a government job where she made a major contribution to the California labor movement. Now, how did she get the power to make changes, and how did she use that power? For once, I have all the details. Katherine was born in Ohio. At a Chicago Music Conservatory, she married her opera teacher, Charles Edson, after he promised to show her the grand opera centers of Europe. He said, "There's just one catch, though. We have to run my family's ranch and almond orchard in California until we earn enough money." So for 9 years, they lived in rural California with their Chinese farmhands. When Katherine was 30, they quit the ranch and moved to Los Angeles. Katherine joined the Friday Morning Club, which was a 3,000-member women's club founded by Unitarian Carolyn Severance. Katherine was the secretary within a year and vice president in 1908. The Friday Morning Club was involved in public health and reform issues. Katherine took an interest in fighting for safe milk. She networked with politicians. She made speeches, and she tirelessly inspected local dairy farms as a private citizen, finding and reporting tubercular cows. She became friends with Meyer Listner, a reformer with whom she sat on the executive committee of the the National Municipal League. The NML, which was started by Teddy Roosevelt, was a group of progressive and reform city politicians sharing ideas across America. Meanwhile, Katherine and the Friday Morning Club were pushing for women's suffrage. Katherine was the only woman at the 1910 Republican Convention in Sacramento. She lobbied them until the Republicans added women's suffrage to their platform. She became well known and very useful to the Republican candidate for governor, Hiram Johnson. In 1911, when Katherine was 41, Hiram became governor, and women got the right to vote in California. Well, we're just getting started. Hiram saw Katherine as an important ally, and he appointed her as a deputy inspector of the California Bureau of Labor Statistics. While Hiram went after electoral reform and the corrupt power of the Southern Pacific Railroad, Katherine tackled workers' health and compensation. The Friday Morning Club was part of the statewide California Federation of Women's Clubs. Katherine used it to collect data and to raise consciousness among middle-class women. She got the president of each club to survey local wages, hours, and labor conditions. It turned out that the biggest problem was for 22,000 women, mostly Italian and Portuguese immigrants, working in canning factories. They worked long hours in physically crippling conditions for an inadequate wage. Katherine presented the minimum wage as a family health issue, like safe milk. She said that private businesses affect the public good, and so they must not go unregulated. The Women's Legislation Council became the most powerful lobby in the state, surpassing, according to Wikipedia, racetrack owners. Well, imagine that. In 1913, Katherine helped draft a bill with comprehensive wage and hours laws. The bill was delayed by opposition from surprising quarters. Local unions opposed it because they saw Katherine as competition to their own power and because their membership was patriarchal. But Governor Johnson pushed for the bill 5 days before its deadline, and it passed easily. The bill created an Industrial Welfare Commission, the IWC, to uphold its laws, and Johnson appointed Katherine as one of the 5 members. She would serve there for 18 years, overseeing wage setting, monitoring, and enforcement. The IWC interviewed 1,000 working women. On that basis, Katherine calculated the cost of living as being $9.63 per week. Now, half of working women earned less than $9 a week. So the IWC raised the minimum to $10 per week in 1917, to $13.50 in 1919, and $16 in 1920. However, the employers and her own statistics persuaded Katherine to claw it back again to $15 per week in 1921. Naturally, that created an uproar from labor unions who unsuccessfully sued to claw back Katherine's salary of $84 per week. Katherine raised the minimum back up to $16 in 1922. Her legislating was so successful that other government departments came to her for advice. By 1926, the IWC had expanded to include hotels, restaurants, and the movie industry. It still didn't cover all industries, so Katherine also led an advisory board where employers and employees made agreements on wages, especially firms working Navy contracts during World War I. She said, I do not want to mediate. I want to avoid the need for mediation. In 1920, Katherine campaigned federally for Warden G. Harding, and he appointed her an advisor to the Washington Limitation of Arms Conference. She lobbied for minimum wages overseas, saying a life-sustaining wage is more vital to world peace than battleships. In 1923, after the U.S. Supreme Court declared a minimum wage in Washington, D.C. to be unconstitutional, California's minimum wage law withstood a similar challenge. California senators sought an injunction in the name of a woman who wanted to apprentice at a candy factory for $6 a week. The case collapsed after the woman herself said that she was being used. In 1931, under a new administration, Katherine was removed from leadership of the IWC. She remained as an advisor to her successor. Across 20 years, she made a real contribution to securing a decent living for working-class Americans. Well, if this talk made sense, I owe it to Dr. Jacqueline Breitman. In a 1986 magazine article, Dr. Breitman made a coherent story out of the laundry list of societies and acronyms and appointments that I found in other sources. And of course, all mistakes remain my own. I think I only said I had 2 agents of change, but I see I snuck George Exoo in here. George Exoo was an assisted suicide activist. By his own count, he helped 103 suicides before his own death from cancer in 2015. As a Universalist, he believed in a better afterlife for all, which made him cheerful in his work. Ireland tried to extradite George from the United States to face charges that could carry 14 years in prison. An American judge ruled that he did not have to go, citing differences between Irish and American law. One observer named John Ronson traveled with George and filmed him. In Ronson's opinion, George did not inquire deeply enough into a patient's medical outlook and state of mind. If you thought you were ready for the next life, George was glad to send you there. Ronson's documentary is called Reverend Death. Myself, I believe in assisted suicide, but with strong safeguards. I think the assisted death of Canadian poet Al Purdy through Canadian activist John Hofstede in the year 2000 was a good death. Hofstede himself traveled to Switzerland to take his own life at a clinic on February 29th, 2016. I don't really know enough about George's record, and I reserve my judgment on him. Let's do education. This is William Greenleaf Elliott, grandfather of T.S. Eliot. William had 14 children, which is one of the reasons this show is overrun by Elliots. He graduated from Harvard Divinity School in 1834 and went to St. Louis, Missouri, which was growing fast. 20,000 people in 1840, 160,000 people in 1860. There he founded the first Unitarian congregation west of the Mississippi. He also co-founded Washington University in St. Louis. Actually, against his wishes, its original name was Elliott Seminary. William lived in St. Louis for 43 years, and the university was just one of his many projects. He helped found the St. Louis Public Schools, St. Louis Art Museum, Mission Free School, and Southside Day Nursery. He founded a girls' school called the Mary Institute after a daughter who died young. He helped develop the Colored Orphans Home, Soldiers Orphans Home, Memorial Home, Blind Girls Home, and Women's Christian Home. When the Civil War came, he helped persuade Missouri to stay in the Union and helped set up the Western Sanitary Commission, to prevent disease in the Union Army. The Sanitary Commission is strongly connected with the Red Cross. Ralph Waldo Emerson visited St. Louis, and he called William the Saint of the West. Here's another Elliot, Charles William Elliot. He made Harvard what it is today, a world-class research university. Charles attended Harvard like his father and grandfather before him, and he got a job there teaching math and chemistry. But at age 29, when he didn't get the Rumford Chair in chemistry, which would be like getting tenure today, he quit. Everyone assumed he would go into business to support his family, but he didn't. Charles used a legacy from his grandfather to spend 2 years exploring education in Europe. He saw that Europe's great universities were founded by the aristocracy or supported by government grants. More importantly, he saw that European universities helped European economies, giving them research results and young men schooled in practical matters. Most American schools still had a curriculum centered on the classics. Learn your foreign languages and do your poetry. In 1869, Charles published his findings in Atlantic Monthly. Harvard promptly hired him as president, a post he held for a record 40 years. That's even more remarkable when we learn that he tried to abolish football. He did abolish required courses. He replaced recitations with lectures and seminars. His goal was graduates with a commitment to public service, specialized training, and a capacity to change and adapt. Excuse me. He wanted graduates who could step into leadership roles in a modern society. He established strict entrance examinations. Other universities followed suit, and the result was a general improvement in secondary school academic standards. Not having a European aristocracy to draw on, Charles tackled America's aristocrats, the rich. If Bill Gates and Warren Buffett had been around in 1880, Charles would have asked them to give half their fortunes to Harvard. The Elliots were influential in Boston. Charles's father had been mayor of Boston. His fundraising was so successful that Harvard became, and remains today, the wealthiest private university in the world. Charles used those funds to turn Harvard into America's preeminent research university. Charles was progressive in matters of race. Many African Americans were educated at Harvard, and he placed no barriers against Catholics or Jews. However, he was not a fan of Katherine Edson, our California reformer, nor she of him. He did not allow women into Harvard and was a strong opponent to labor unions, allowing Harvard students to be used as strikebreakers. Before Charles Eliot, many Unitarians attended Harvard as a matter of course. They lived near Boston. Harvard was Boston's university, and Harvard Divinity School was the training ground for the Unitarian ministry. After Charles Eliot, being from Harvard was a mark of excellence. Unitarianism and Harvard symbiotically increased each other's prestige and influence. Here's the first of our many Emersons, Charles Wesley Emerson. He started as a minister, obtained a medical degree that he never used, and switched to elocution and oratory. In 1880, he founded the Boston Conservatory of Elocution, Oratory, and Dramatic Art, with an initial enrollment of 10 students. It was renamed Emerson College of Oratory in 1890 and shortened to Emerson College in 1939. The college has thrived despite a financial crisis in 1952. For its first 90 years, it was housed in a series of buildings in Boston's Back Bay area, including some on the very Unitarian Beacon Street. Since 1992, the college has moved to the theater district, and it actually has several theaters. Its main building is the Ensign building across from Boston Commons. In 2020, they finished a renovation with glass facades between the building's iconic finger towers. Here's Walter Jenkin Evans. He read at Oxford and then went home to his Welsh town of Carmarthen for life. He was principal of Carmarthen Presbyterian College, then Dean of Divinity at the University of Wales. He wrote histories and biographies about Carmarthen's Unitarians. Back to America and back to the Emersons. Here is Dr. William Emerson, a great nephew of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was an architect and the first dean of architecture at MIT. William attended Harvard, Columbia University, and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He spent time in New York City designing banks, houses, and low-income tenements. He worked in France for the Bureau of Construction of the American Red Cross in World War I, and then returned to start 20 years as dean at MIT. He expanded the curriculum to include classes on city planning and seminars on the practical challenges of working as an architect. On his retirement in 1939, age 66, he was made Dean Emeritus at MIT and received an honorary doctorate from Harvard. William had an interest in Byzantine architecture. This slide shows a telegram to Emerson from Robert Van Nies after Emerson appointed Robert to survey the Byzantine masterwork, the huge, beautiful, and ancient Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. William also helped found the Unitarian Service Committee. We've talked about the USC before. It began as a standing committee of the American Unitarian Association in response to the Czechoslovakian refugee crisis caused by Hitler's occupation. During World War II, the USC worked from Prague and then later from Marseille and finally from Lisbon to help the French underground get Jews, Unitarians, and others out of Nazi-occupied Europe and cared for until they were resettled. William was chairman of that standing committee from 1940 to 1948. When the USC became a separate corporation in 1948, he was first president. He held the post for 5 years to age 80 and remained honorary president until his death at 83. Flipping again to the Elliots, Abigail Adams Elliott was a Boston aristocrat. In this picture, she and British aristocrat Queen Mary, wife of King George V, are visiting a British nursery school. At age 30, Abigail was encouraged to open a nursery school in Boston. It became her life's work, affecting millions. She was founder of the National Association for Nursery Education, and now the 90,000 member National Association, which is now the 90,000 member National Association for the Education of Young Children, which promotes and accredits childhood learning programs. She supervised the Depression-era Federal Emergency Relief Administration's nursery school program in New England, and she co-founded the Elliott Community Mental Health Center in Concord, Massachusetts. She continued her own education as well, earning a Master's of Education and a PhD from Harvard. Life and education must have suited her, and she lived to the wonderful age of 100 years and 20 days. Coming into arts and literature. Our first quickie guy is William Enfield, a British Unitarian minister and a teacher of rhetoric. He published a best-selling book of elocution called The Speaker. Next is Mary Moody Emerson. She was an aunt of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who called her his earliest and best teacher, a spirited and original genius in her own right, and a blessing which nothing else in education could supply. Nice quotes. Waldo published a collection of Mary's letters and diaries. Mary refused to call herself Unitarian or any other sect, marching to her own drum, but she was a major influence on nephew Waldo, so I snuck her into our Unitarian show. John Epps was an English doctor, born in Kent, educated in Edinburgh, and practicing in London. I can't bring myself to put him in the science section, so I have him here as a writer of science fiction, although I admit he would not agree to being put there. Epps was into phrenology, that's reading personality from bumps on the head, and homeopathy, which at that time meant trying to cure diseases using diluted doses of poisons that, when not diluted, created the same symptoms as the disease. And that doesn't work, as it turns out. Two of his sci-fi books are Internal Evidences of Christianity Deduced from Phrenology, a title that explains itself, and Rejected Cases, a self-published book of reports on homeopathic treatments that were rejected, with cause, by Britain's medical journal, The Lancet. I should say, since I'm speaking against homeopathy, I should say that I'm not against naturopathy. Naturopathy means trying to heal the body without drugs or surgery, and that's not unscientific. We can examine the remedies case by case. Homeopaths, chiropractors, and osteopaths all use some naturopathy, so we can't reject all of their cures out of hand. But it's worth knowing that all three of them were founded on pseudoscience, which they have never renounced. And so you should take all of them with a grain of salt. I applaud Epps for being an anti-slavery abolitionist and a British pro-democracy Chartist. And I put scenes on his slide from the Newport Chartist mural. He also championed England's poor. He self-identified as a Christian, though he denied the existence of the immortal soul, and of hell, and of the devil, and of the Trinity. He denounced Protestant churches as, quote, harlot daughters of Rome, unquote, at a time when both Catholics and sex workers were frowned upon. Here is Charlotte Champe Stearns Elliott, a St. Louis social worker and a poet. Charlotte wrote a biography of her father, William Greenleaf Elliott, and she was the mother of T.S. Eliot. Her husband, Henry Ware Elliott, was a successful businessman and philanthropist. He spent most of his career manufacturing bricks, perhaps inspired by his father's many charitable building ventures. Maud Howe Elliott was a suffragist and a founder of the Progressive Party, but she's best known as a Pulitzer Prize winner. She and her sister, Laura Richards, won that award for a biography of their Unitarian mother, Julia Ward Howe. Julia was the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And now we're finally at T.S. Eliot. Here is Thomas Stearns Eliot, the big one who got away. T.S. was the grandson of William Greenleaf Elliott, born in St. Louis and raised in Boston. He was born with a hernia that kept him out of sports and rough games, and perhaps as a result, he was bookish from the start. You could say that he was old before he was young. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is the story of a middle-aged man. It includes the lines, I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. T.S. wrote that when he was age 22. T.S. earned a philosophy degree at Harvard, spent a year at the Sorbonne, and ended up in London by age 26. At 27, he began an unhappy marriage to a sickly wife. Eliot said the marriage created the state of mind that produced his great poem, The Wasteland. That's the one with the line, April is the cruelest month. A great poet, but never a sunny one. Perhaps his most famous lines are from The Hollow Men. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. At age 39, T.S. became a British citizen and a member of the Church of England. I can't really regret that he renounced Unitarianism, because I cannot imagine a Unitarian writing my favorite T.S. Eliot work, Murder in the Cathedral, about the martyrdom of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in the year 1170. Most of the play is very formal in iambic pentameter with the kind of chorus used in ancient Greece. But then 4 knights enact a murder scene, like the shower scene from Psycho, slaughtering Becket horribly before our eyes. And then the knights break the fourth wall, speaking to the audience in modern prose. Here's a few shortened quotes. First knight, we beg you to give us your attention for a few moments. We know that you may be disposed to judge unfavorably of our action. You are Englishmen, and when you see one man being set upon by 4, then your sympathies are all with the underdog. The second knight says, I dare say that we didn't make a very good impression when we came in. The fact is that we knew we had taken on a pretty stiff job. I only speak for myself, but I had drunk a good deal. I am not a drinking man ordinarily, to brace myself up for it. When you come to the point, it does go against the grain to kill an archbishop, especially when you have been brought up in good church traditions. The third knight said, I am going to appeal not to your emotions, but to your reason. You are hard-headed, sensible people, as I can see, and not to be taken in by emotional claptrap. The moment that Becket, at the king's instance, had been made archbishop, he affirmed immediately that there was a higher order than that which our king had for so many years striven to establish. You will agree with me that such interference by an archbishop offends the instincts of a people like ours. So far, I know that I have your approval. I read it in your faces. We have been instrumental in bringing about the state of affairs that you approve. We have served your interests. We merit your applause. And if there is any guilt whatever in the matter, you must share it with us. Unquote. There you have it. Killing God's representative on earth was good for politics and good for business. We're just like you. You would have done the same thing. Zing. And that is how the pious Anglican T.S. Eliot twitted England in 1935. I believe his Unitarian love of social justice, combined with his Anglican respect for godly authority, crafted a powerful and moving message. Don Elkins is a journalist, broadcaster, and blogger. He was a nightly broadcast journalist on a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, and then in Salt Lake City, where he also taught college-level Russian, and then in Chicago, and then he got an offer from Fayetteville in Northwest Arkansas. I believe he's still in Northwest Arkansas 20 years later, providing a Unitarian viewpoint to counterbalance Fox News. He's well enough known that it's thought he could win in state politics. And coming near the end, we have Emma's Revolution. Emma Goldman once said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution, which makes Emma's Revolution an excellent name for a lesbian band performing folk music and protest songs. The lead musicians are Pat Humphreys and Sandy O, and their songs won praise from Pete Seeger. They've also shared a stage with Reverend Jesse Jackson, with the Indigo Girls, and with Joan Baez. Recent songs include So Impeachable, a parody, Sing People Sing, a tribute to Pete Seeger, I Believe Her, which is their hashtag #MeToo song, and Are People Gonna Rise for Black Lives Matter. And that is our last for today. I just need to remember how to stop the recording. There we go.